Good day everyone. In this video we'll be talking about JavaScript loops. Now let's go ahead and create our file. Let's create a new file and call it, let's save it as loops.js. Before we go into loops, there are other ways we can declare variables in JavaScript. Aside the normal var keyword that we've been using, there are some other ways we can do that, and I'm going to explain them here. So one way you can declare variables is like you can use let. So you can say let x be equal to 1, and if you go ahead and console.log x to the screen, and you run your node loops.js, you can see that we have 1 printed out to the screen. Now the difference between let and the var keyword is just that when you declare let like this, or a let variable that you declare in a block statement, for example, if let's do if a, let's use the string a, and let's say if a is equal to the same string a, which would return true, then let's go ahead and declare let's say let x be equal to this is true. So in this case, what we are doing is we are checking if a is equal to a, which is true. Then we are declaring a variable let s be equal to this is true. Now if we go ahead and run this, we can see that we get an error. Why? Because any let, and if you use let to declare a variable inside a block, you cannot access that variable outside the block. If we go ahead to change this to var, and we save that, and we come here and we run node loops.js again, we can see that we have this is true. But meanwhile, we can use let to declare a variable, but a let variable declared inside a block cannot be used outside of the block. Now there's another way we can declare variables, which is using the const keyword. So you can use the const keyword to declare your variable, and the const there means constant. So for constant variables, they can only be used to define a constant variable, a variable that does not change, that the value in there does not change. So you can declare a variable x is equal to 12 as a constant, and you can print that out also to the screen. Console.log x to the screen, and you can go ahead and run this, and you have your 12. But if you try to, you cannot redefine or redeclare let. You cannot say x is equal to 13 now. You cannot come here and say x is equal to 13 and then go back ahead to run it. See, it gives you an error because you declared x as a constant, and after declaring it as a constant, then you try to change the value. Now unlike let, you can declare a constant inside a block and use it outside of the block. So you can still go back and say if a is equal to a, which is always true, then define constant x as. If you go ahead and run this, okay, constant as well. If you define constant inside a block, you would not be able to access it outside of the block. So those are two new ways you can declare variables in JavaScript, and we might be using them a couple of times. So now back to our topic for the day. We are talking about loops. Loops can execute a block of code a number of times, and maybe each time with a different value. We mostly use loops when we are working with arrays. Now, for example, we can do something like console.log one, then just go ahead and copy that and replace all of this with 2, 3, 4, 5. If you go ahead and run this, you can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 printed to the screen, but we have had to repeat our code over here. So when you have something that would be repeated, you might want to look into using loops to do that. So in JavaScript, we have different types of loops. We have the for loop. And the for loop loops through a block of code a number of times. We'll be giving examples. We have the for in loops, which loops through the properties of an object. We have the for off loop, which loops through the values of an iterable object. We have the while loop, which loops through a block of code while a specified condition is met, and do while loop, which also loops through a block of code while a specified condition is met. And we also have the for each loop, which is a JavaScript array property, a property function that we can use to loop through an array. And we are going to be looking at a couple of them in this video, and maybe we'll continue with them. So for example, what we did earlier was we printed out 1 to the screen over and over again. Now what we can do is let's go ahead and create a for loop. Now the for loop, which I said loops through a block of code. It loops through a block of code a number of times. You declare a for loop by just using the following syntax. So there are 3 statements that a for loop takes. Statement 1, then we have statement 2, we have statement 2, then we have statement 3, then you open your block. So now how this works is that the statement 1 is executed one time before the execution of the code block. This is the first thing that it looks at. It executes this one first, then the second one is it defines the condition for running this code block. You would understand when we start working with examples. Then the statement 3 is executed every time after the code block is executed. So now let's give an example of this statement 1. We can declare a variable here, which mostly that's what you are going to be doing. So you can say for variable I is equal to 0. So we declare the I variable here. Then here we can say I less than 10, then I plus plus. So now, like we said, this statement 1 is executed one time. So in this statement 1, we declared a variable I and we set it equal to 0. Then we said the statement 2 defines the condition for running the code block. In this case, what we are saying is, as long as I is less than 10, then run whatever we put inside our code block. Then the third statement, which runs after this code block has been executed, is that okay, after we have checked if I is less than 10 and we have executed this code block, then add 1 to I, then we can now come back to do this. So now let's go ahead and do something inside our code block. Now you can just go ahead and just console.log I. If you go ahead and save this, let me clear my terminal so we can just go ahead and run again, and you can see we have 0 first, 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9. Now you see, initially to print out this we have to use console.log I 1, console.log 0, console.log 1, console.log 2. But with this small block of code, and we can do it up to even 50, we can print out 50 lines to the screen by just manipulating our loop. If we go ahead and run this again, you can see we have 0 to 49. Now explaining this, what just happens here is that, okay, we are saying for as long as, first of all, I is equal to 0, and then we are saying for as long as that I that we declared as 0 over here still remains less than 50, then print it out to the screen. Then when you print it out to the screen, then go ahead and add 1 to it. So when you add 1 to it, so at the first stage, let's make this 2. So let's just run it. If we are to be the one running the code, not the compiler. So I is equal to 0. This is what is happening. I is equal to 0 first. Then we are checking if I is less than 2. Is I less than 2? Yes, currently yes. So what are we doing? We are printing out 1, console.log 0, which is I currently. So we print out 0. So after we print out 0, then we add 1 to I. So I now becomes 1. So when I becomes 1, then is I less than 2? Still 1 is less than 2, so yes. So what we do is we print out I, which is now 1. So we type out 1 there. Then I plus plus, which means we add 1 to I. So I plus 1 is equal to I plus 1, which is 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. So now we check here, we check 2, is I less than 2, is 2 less than 2, which is no. So if 2 is not less than 2, then we just know that we are done with the loop. So now if we go ahead and run this, we can see that we just have 0 1, which is the logic we have explained over here. So that's how arrays work. That's how loops work, the for loop work. It can be a little more complex, but then you can use this in terms of arrays. For example, now we can say variable my array is equal to an array of 23 45 96 09 12 49. So we have an array that contains 1 2 3 4 5 6, and we are aware that array uses indexes. So this one is array 0. So what we can do is we can just say I is equal to 0. Then as far as I is less than, now let's get the length of our array. Var length is equal to we said my array dot length to get the length of our array. So now we want it to loop over the length of our array. So now the length of our array, the last index will be the length of our array minus 1, right? So what we have to do is we are saying I less than the length we have declared here, in which length is equal to, so that means if we get to length we are done. Or we can say I greater than, or we can just say my length is equal to my array dot length minus 1. If we go ahead and save that, we can now say I less than or equal to the length of the array. So now if we go ahead, what we can just do now is, now we are incrementing I also, because this is 0, this is 1. We want to increment I and operate over that. We can now say console.log. Then what do we print out? We print out my array, then I. So this variable is 0 at this point. So in the first stage, variable I is equal to 0. Is I less than or equal to length? Yes. Then I plus plus. So what we are saying is that it should print out the first index, which is 0, the 0 index of our array. After doing that, it should add 1, then print it out up till we get the length, up till the length of our array is exhausted. So if we go ahead and run this, we should have all our array print out to the screen, because so we have 23, 45, 96, 9, 12 and 49 print out to the screen. So that's how you loop through arrays. You just have to use the index in the argument. You use a variable to depict the index, and you call the index inside your block statement where you do what you want to do. So that's about the for loop. And let's do the while loop before we call it a day for today. So doing the same thing, you can also do it using the while loop. So we can just go ahead and leave this. We have our array, my array, and we have the length of our array minus 1 as the number of times we want to. So we can just go ahead and use, rather than using the for loop, we can use the while loop, which I said it loops through a block of code while a specified condition is met. So we can just say while I is less than or equal to length, which is the length of our array. Then just go ahead and print out. Just go ahead and print out my array, then I to the screen. If we go ahead and run this, we should have an error because we have not declared I, and we are just saying if I is less than or equal to length, it should do that. So what we have to do, let's run it first to be sure we get an error. We get an error here, and I is not defined. In for loop, we define what we want to use initially, but here we can define it before our block of code for the while loop. So we can just say I is equal to 0 at this point. Now we are saying why I is less than or equal to length. If we keep running this, we keep getting 23 print out to the screen, because at every point I is equal to 0, which means I is less than or equal to length. So it just prints out I. So it prints out the 0 index of our array. So for us to get it to not do that, what we have to do is, after running our block of statements, we have to run the increment. So if we go ahead and run this, and then we can have our array print out to the screen. So what we have done here is I is equal to 0 at this point, then check if I is less than or equal to length. 0 is less than or equal to length at this point. So what we have is it prints out the index of our array, the I index of our array, then it adds an increment. So after the first instance, I becomes 1, then 1 is still less than or equal to length, so it prints out 45, and it goes on and on and on and does that. Now another type of loop we can look at is the do while loop. So the do while loop is the same as the while loop, it just takes a whole different syntax. In fact, the syntax are very similar. What we just have is we have a do function, rather than having a while function. What we have here is we have a do function. So we have a do function, and inside the do function we have our block of code which is telling us that it should come in. So we have our statement here, then we just have to have a while statement as well. So we just inside here say while I is less than length, or less than or equal to length. So what we are saying is that do all of this while I is less than or equal to length, and we have incremented I here. So immediately I becomes 6, then it would not run again, because I now is equal to length. So if we go ahead and run this, we can see that we still have our array printout to the screen. Now for the next video we'll be talking about for each and maybe a couple of other stuffs, which is the array function that you use to perform actions on arrays while looping through them. But thank you, I hope you enjoyed this video.